My name's Darren Holmes, and today we're going to be talking about the Raspberry Pi. So this device here is the Raspberry Pi that most people think about when you say Raspberry Pi. It's the Raspberry Pi 4 Model B. So this is the Raspberry Pi 400, and basically it's the Raspberry Pi 4 stuffed into a little keyboard. But we're not talking about either of those devices in this video series. We're here to talk about the smallest Raspberry Pi, and it's the Raspberry Pi Pico. So this is actually an embedded microcontroller, and we're going to be doing a whole video series on how to use this newest device from Raspberry Pi that just came out in 2021. So to get started, let's go to our favorite web browser. I'm using Firefox, and in Google type in Raspberry Pi Pico and press enter. So when the results come up, we're going to scroll down past the ads, and what we're looking for is something from raspberrypi.com. So if you click on that particular link there, it comes up and tells you something about the Raspberry Pi. It's going to give you this warning about cookies, so I'll just say got it. So this is what the Raspberry Pi looks like. We need some documentation on this thing, so click on documentation, and we're going to be programming it in MicroPython. And you'll see one of the items that comes up here is MicroPython documentation. So click on that. So this is the web page that comes up. It's official Raspberry Pi documentation. It tells you what MicroPython is. And then under documentation, you can see that they've actually written a book getting started with MicroPython on the Raspberry Pi Pico. So what we're going to do is we can click on buy the book on the Raspberry Pi press site. So you can see this book is about £10, so it's coming from the UK. Now if you scroll down here, it says if you would like to see the full errata, please click here. So just click on that. And you can see it's the getting started with MicroPython on Raspberry Pi Pico. And you can see that there is a free download. So click on the free download. And do not hesitate to donate some money. It's to a worthy cause here. Or you can click on no thanks, take me to the free PDF. So it's going to come up and you can see this version is version 10. So instead of opening it with Firefox, we're going to save the file. Say OK. And you can see it's going to save it in my downloads folder. So I'm just going to click on save. So when it's done downloading, you can actually click on the downloaded file folder, and you can see it brings it up for us. So if you double click on it, it should open it up for us, and you can see it's the entire book on Raspberry Pi. So the next document we need is some kind of reference manual for Python. So up here on your URL line, just type in python.org. So when the website comes up, this is all the documentation you're going to need for Python. So you can click on documentation. And what we're looking for here is browse the docs online or download a copy of your own. So you can browse these online, but I like to have a download. So I'm going to click on Python docs. And over here you can see it says download these documents. So just click on that, and then you can download it in whatever format you would like. So I'm going to do it in a PDF US letter paper size. So you can see it's about 13 meg, so just click on that. And we're going to save that file and say OK. I'm going to put it in my downloads folder. So I'm going to click on save. So once it's done downloading, we can click on the little file folder, and you can see it brings it up for us. So if you double click on it, you can see it has some docs.pdf. So there's a whole bunch of different documentation in here. So the one we're looking for is tutorial.pdf. So when we bring that up, we can scroll down here, and we can see that we've got documentation for if statements, for statements, those kind of things. So this is on page 19, so I'm going to scroll down to page 19. So you can see on page 19 it talks about the if statement, and it gives us some kind of format that we need to follow. The format we need to follow is called syntax. So that's what we really wanted to get this documentation for, so we know what the complete syntax is for some of the statements that we're going to be using in MicroPython. So the next thing that we need to do is download an IDE. That's an integrated development environment, and also some kind of interpreter or compiler for the Python language. So Raspberry Pi uses Thorny, so you can type in THONNY, and you notice one of the items that comes up is Thorny IDE. So just go ahead and click on that, and you can see that there is a thorny.org. So just go ahead and click on that. And this is the IDE for beginners, and it gives you a little idea of what it looks like on your screen. So we need to download a version. So this is version 3.3.13, and I'm going to be using it on my laptop, so I'm using Windows. So just go ahead and click on that, and you can see it's a 17 megabyte file. So just click on Save File, and it's going to save it to my downloads, so just click on Save. So what I did was I went through the book, and I went to Abra Electronics, and what I did was I tried to find all the components that were in the book, or things that were close to it as possible. My LCD display ended up being a 4-line display, so that should be exciting. And the total price for the kit came out to $71.20. So after I went ahead and ordered these, Abra came up with a less expensive solution. So I'll show you what that looks like on their website. So rather than ordering all the components individually, you can go to Abra Electronics, and they have a Raspberry Pi Pico basic kit. You can see it's $49.95. The code for it is wave-19693, and if you scroll down the page, you can see it contains all the components that are necessary to do the exercises in that book we just downloaded. You can see it comes with a plastic storage box and a breadboard for your convenience. Also, if you scroll up a little bit here, you can see they have a link to Hackspace to get your free PDF version. That's the Raspberry Pi Pico book, Get Started with MicroPython. So if you click on that link, it takes you over to Hackspace, where you get the same "would you like to donate?" or you can say "no thank you, take me to the free PDF." And you can see it's the digital version 10, so you can click on Save File, click on OK, and you can see it's the same file that we just downloaded previously. So now that you have a copy of the book to follow, we're going to be soldering in the header pins, and the book goes over how to do this in great detail. We can either use some putty to hold the pins in place, or we can place it on a breadboard. So I'm going to show you how to do that, but also in here it gives you some soldering tips that you should review before you start soldering your board together. So if you order Abra's kit, the header pins come soldered to the board. However, if you order the Raspberry Pi Pico by itself, you're going to have to order these. These are called header pins. It's actually called a snappable header because you can actually break them at these individual points. So these are actually 40 pins. So what we need to do is line them up with our Raspberry Pi Pico. So just take it and put it into the set of holes there, and that will tell you how many you need. Make sure you do line it up at the front here. So when we get down to the last one, just put your thumbnail in there. Okay, so you can see I've got my thumbnail in there, and just push on the snappable header and it'll just break off. So then you've got the second set here, and they'll go into the second row of holes. So now we need to stabilize them so that they don't wiggle all over the place while you're trying to solder them. So I like to place them into a breadboard for soldering. So on my breadboard, what I do is I take the header pins and I just put them in. Make sure that you get it all lined up, and then just push them down. So if you've got a newer breadboard, they're going to be harder to put in. So it actually goes in the center or the third row over. So you're going to do the same thing with the second row. So once you've slid them in, just turn your board sideways and try and make sure that all the pins are about the same height. Sometimes they slide through this piece of plastic, right? So the plastic's just there to hold them in place when you put it in. So once you've got your two rows in there, it doesn't matter which way around you orient your board, just put it on top and try to get those pins in all those holes. So now this will hold it steady for you while you solder these into place. In order to solder these pins to your Raspberry Pi Pico board, we're going to need a few items. We need a soldering iron. I'm going to use a 30-watt soldering iron. I like 30 watts because it heats the pin up fast and you can get the solder in, get the joints soldered together, and take the heat away before the heat transfers to any plastic components. Some people like to use a lower wattage iron, but then you have to leave it on the pin longer to heat the pin up to the correct temperature. And while you're slowly heating it up, then the plastic on the components melts. So I like to go with like a 30-watt iron. You're going to need a sponge to clean the tip off. Make sure the sponge is damp. If you don't have a sponge, you can use wet paper towel. It doesn't need to be dripping wet, but just make sure that it is damp, because if you run a hot tip over something that's dry, you're going to end up burning it. You're also going to need some solder. This is 60-40 tin lead solder. I like the lead because it flows easier. A lot of places you can't get the lead anymore, so you have to go with a silver solder or something else. This solder is 0.8 millimeters in diameter. And the last thing you're going to need is some kind of safety glasses. These are reading glasses that I got from the dollar store, and you can see they actually magnify what you're looking at. So a lot of people will tell me, I can read my phone okay, I can see to read close up, but I recommend you try and I mean they're like $1 at the dollar store. Try and get the highest magnification you can. Try them on and you'll be surprised how much closer you can see, and they will also give you some protection to your eyes. Okay, so let's get started soldering these pins in place. So the first thing you're going to do is clean the tip of your soldering iron on the sponge. so that it looks fairly nice and shiny, and put a little bit of solder on that tip. So ideally the solder is going to be sticking to the tip, not falling off. So if it's falling off, you have to clean your tip. Okay, so we need the solder to stick on the tip, just like I'm showing here. Okay, we don't want a lot of solder on there, so just clean it off once you've put a bit of solder on there. And this is why we use a damp sponge. So bring your tip back and just put a little tiny piece of solder on there. Okay, so now the idea is to heat up the largest component first. So we're soldering two components together, right? We're soldering the pin to the pad on the board. The pin is actually thicker than the pad that we're trying to solder to. So when you bring your tip in, you want to heat the pin up first. So make contact with the pin first, then bring it down to the pad, bring the solder in, and we're just trying to get a little bit of solder on there and then run the tip up the pin. So we're not looking for a blob of solder, we just want it on there just to kind of hold the pin in place, make sure that it covers the entire pad, and we want it to go circular all the way around the pin, and that'll just hold it in place there. Now what I like to do is when I've soldered my first pin in place, I like to go down to maybe the other end of the board and solder that pin in place, just to make sure that the board is sitting flat. So you might want to take your finger, press down on the board, make sure it is flat. Now bring a little bit of solder onto your tip. Remember, we're going to try and heat up the pin first, and then onto the pad, then bring the solder in. And you can see how much is going onto the pad, and then run it up the tip. So I just want to remind you, after you've soldered a couple pins in, clean off the tip of the soldering iron. Then come back in, put a little bit of solder on the end of your tip. Okay, now as you're soldering these, heat's going to build up in one location. So I like to solder every other pin. So I've soldered the first pin. I'm not going to do the second. I'm going to go to the third. I'm going to heat up that pin, then heat up the pad, then bring the solder in. And sometimes it takes a couple goes, and then run the tip up the pin, and hopefully the solder will go around the pad. So I'm just going to carry on doing every other pin. So now you can go back and do the pins in between. So remember, a little bit of solder on the tip to help the heat transfer. Now remember, if you don't like the solder joint, you can always go back, reheat it. Now it's going to heat up faster than it did before, and you can add a tiny little bit more solder. The goal is to not add too much solder, because if you have too much solder, then it's really hard to take off afterwards. So now you can look over your soldering, see if there's any that might need a little extra solder. Just go back in, heat it up, put some solder in, and get out of there pretty quick. So I just want to remind you, when we're soldering, the only thing that's melting is the solder. We're not actually melting the pin, we're not melting the pad. We're actually melting the solder that we're putting on there, and it's just flowing around the hot pin, the hot pad, to make a good electrical connection. So now, once we've done soldering the pins to our circuit board, it's not going to fall off of the breadboard very easily. So what you need to do is take your screwdriver and just run the head of it down that little valley and underneath the board, and just gently lift up at one end, and then place your screwdriver at the other end and just gently lift up at the other end, and just keep going back and forth, and slowly your board will pry out of your breadboard. Don't try and do it all in one go. If you put too much pressure at one end and try and lift it up, you could snap your board in half. So we want to avoid doing that. Sometimes one side lets go before the other, and then eventually it will let go. So now you can examine your board, make sure that the solder is to your liking. Another thing is, if you manage to pry just one end up, then you're going to end up bending the legs at the back end. So that's why we pry from both the front and the bottom. So the next section in the book is installing MicroPython onto your Raspberry Pi Pico. It's changed a little bit from what's in the book, so I'm going to go over that in the video with you next. So in order to run MicroPython on the Raspberry Pi Pico, we need to load the file onto our Raspberry Pi Pico. Now to do this, what we're going to do is we're going to press the boot select button. So there's only one button on our Raspberry Pi Pico, so just press that button in, and then using your USB cable, plug that into your laptop or your desktop computer, and then you can let go of the button. So when you let go of the button, you can see Microsoft Explorer pops open, and down here you can see we have something called RPI-RP2, and it's got a drive letter of D. If you go ahead and do a right click on that and ask for the properties, you can see we have approximately 127 megabytes of room. So this is being opened up as a USB drive. The file system is FAT for File Allocation Table. So what we want to do is come in here, and you'll notice that we have two files. We have the info.txt file, so you can open that up in something like Notepad. So I'm going to say open with Notepad, and that tells you a little bit about your Raspberry Pi Pico. So that's not the one we're interested in. We're interested in this other one here, and it's index.htm. So you can see in my case it's got Firefox selected, so I'm just going to double click on it, and we're going to open it in Firefox, and we're going to say OK. So it redirects you to the Raspberry Pi documentation. So this is Raspberry Pi Pico. Now what we're looking for is MicroPython. So if you come down here, you can see we have something called MicroPython. So just click on that. And in here it says what is MicroPython, so you can read about that. There's documentation. You can read about that, and that's the book we just downloaded. And then here we have something called drag and drop MicroPython. So that's what we're looking for. So it says here you can program your Pico by connecting it to a computer via USB and then dragging and dropping a file onto it. So we've put together a downloadable UF2 file to let you install MicroPython more easily. So you can see right here we have download MicroPython UF2 file. So go ahead and click on that. And what we're going to do is we're going to save the file and click on OK. So it's going to save it to our downloads, so we'll click on Save. So then we have instructions that we need to follow here. So you can see push and hold the boot select button and plug your Pico into the USB port of the Raspberry Pi or other computer, and then release the button. So that is what we've done. It says it will mount a mass storage device. We've already seen that. Now we need to drag and drop the MicroPython UF2 file onto the Raspberry Pi. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. So just click on your downloads and we'll go to that folder. So all we're going to do is, that's the UF2 file. So all we need to do is click on it, hold the button down, and now we can move it around. We want to put it onto D drive. Now be very careful that you do not drop this onto your C drive. So we're going to drop it onto the D drive, which is RPI-RP2. And just let go. And you'll notice it no longer shows up in Explorer, because what it's done is it's copied the file over to your Pico and has rebooted the Pico, so it's no longer has that boot select button pressed when you originally plugged it into your computer. So this concludes the downloads that we need to get off the internet to get started with our Raspberry Pi Pico. Now we can go and consult the book, Raspberry Pi Pico Digital version 10, and we'll go through that in a little more detail. So this concludes Chapter 1. Please make sure that you do go over it, reread all the sections in Chapter 1. It does talk a little bit more about the details of the Raspberry Pi Pico. And in our next video, in Chapter 2, we're going to be introducing Thonny. It's a Python IDE. IDE stands for Integrated Development Environment. Fancy word for a word processor specifically for programming in Python. So please don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.